The topic that I focused on throughout the semester was American gun violence. And as most people know, it's one of the most heated debates in the country currently. Some people believe that it's caused by mental health crisis, and other people believe that it's caused by laws that aren't restrictive enough. But what a lot of people don't read into is how is it changing over time? Who is it affecting? Those little details are what we're going to analyze through data sets and through the many projects that I did this semester. So here's an example of a really good research study that analyzed restrictive and permissive laws and how that affects the turnout of how many mass shootings happen in states. And you can see the clear trend here, where states that have more restrictive laws aren't getting nearly as many mass shootings as states that have more permissive laws. Forgive the website crashing. So the data set that I chose, I actually picked two, and I found them both on Kaggle through the search term gun violence data set in America. And our first data set has about 260,000 entries. And we're going to use this data set to look at how gun violence has changed over time. It analyzes the years 2013 through 2018. So we have columns here like date and state, and the number killed and the number injured. So we're going to look at the big picture through this data set. As for the second data set, which I also found on Kaggle, we're going to use this one to look more closely at the demographics of people who are dying from gun violence. So we have columns that we're going to use are intent, sex, age, race, and place, so we can get a look at what's really happening close up. As for data-driven questions, the first question is, how has gun violence changed over time? And my prediction for this, as well as we'll find out in the Google Form survey, a lot of people thought that gun violence was increasing over time just because it's so prevalent in the news. As for question 2, what was the leading type of incident? My assumption for this was that it was going to be suicide or military conflicts. For question 3 of where was gun violence the most frequent, my assumption was Chicago, Illinois, and that's just due to them being notorious for having a gun crisis and gang violence. And our final question is, who is dying to gun violence the most? And my prediction is that young non-white people are going to be the people that are dying to gun violence the most. So I started out by collecting original data, and I put out a Google Form survey, and the purpose of this survey was to get a general understanding of what the average person's perceptions and knowledge on American gun violence is. So we're asking questions like, what is your age? How familiar are you with American gun violence statistics? In what year was it at its highest, and at what year was it at its lowest? What's the leading type of gun injury result? In what state is gun violence most frequent? And then we also gave them the option to put in an open-ended answer about their opinion of what's causing the problem. And it was actually quite interesting because most people, about half actually, thought that firearm violence was at its highest in 2018 and at its lowest in 2013. So they think it's increasing with time. But when we ask them where it's more frequent, like they don't have a definite answer. There's not really a trend. It kind of spans. And I can assume that this is because the news frequently puts out these stories about gun violence, but they don't actually go into the details of where it's happening and how it's happening. As for Google Trends, if you look up Google Trends and you look for searches of gun control, you can see a really interesting trend here where the searches for gun control spike right after like notable mass shootings or gun events. So January 2013 is right after the Sandy Hook massacre. We have a bunch of gun violence incidents that happened in 2016, and then you have 2018 where the Parkland shooting happened. So next, I went through the process of cleaning the survey responses. And I did this just visually because there weren't as many entries, but you can do it through searching or filtering. And here we had a lot of data type constraints that were violated. For example, this person put years old after 29. Someone put question marks after Florida, and then another person put the abbreviation for Illinois. As for range constraints, someone put a slew of random numbers here, and then there were also some mandatory constraints where certain columns were empty. And we cleaned these by just removing the years old for the data type, the question marks. I fixed the abbreviation for Illinois. As for range and mandatory, I just had to remove those responses, those rows in full, because there's no way to really supplement them. And then we can start grasping the bigger picture of these responses by making summary tables. So this is from our Google Forms survey. And I did this just to check the consistency between responses. This first column is what year was gun violence at its highest, and this column is what year it was at its lowest. And every age group seemed to answer consistently. As for a summary table from our first data set, this is just a summary table of the sum of people killed in each state, and we can really look at each state and see which numbers are higher and which numbers are lower, and then maybe look for some trends within them. For example, a lot of states in the South, like Louisiana and Kentucky, Mississippi, Missouri, they all have more permissive gun laws, and they end up with larger death counts. This brings us to making visualizations from our dataset. This dataset that I found online from the DataViz gallery is actually quite interesting because it does a really good job at including so much information in such a relatively small space. And it was actually made using the exact same dataset that I'm using in the first portion of my project. Here you can see it does a really good job at looking at the bigger picture. It highlights what states more people are dying from gun violence in, and it also shows the huge chunk that Chicago takes out of those statistics. This is a bar chart I made using the first dataset. And what we can understand from this bar chart is that the total number killed and the total number injured fluctuate at the same rate throughout time. There's no difference in how they're growing or decreasing. So I took the liberty to make my own visualization, and these time charts here analyze the number killed and number injured on a day-to-day basis throughout time. And you can see here 20 to 40 people are killed by gun violence every day. This just further pushes the point that those deaths could be prevented. And we can see here, if we look at Chicago compared to all other counties and cities, Chicago still takes up a huge portion of that pie chart. If you think about how many counties are in the US total, this is such a drastic statistic. So using Python, I made a program that gives users the option to look through all the calculations and statistics and visualizations that I made using these data sets. They can look at the results from basic statistics to the visualizations that we made. They can look at visualizations from our Google Forms survey, and they can also look at what we found from our data set. The program uses a lot of functions, but I've classified them in certain categories. The program uses multiple modules, which are just operations you can import into Python. I'll use check choice as an example because I use it a lot in the program. So here we're defining check choice, and within it we're giving it a minimum and maximum. So we're going to start out by defining the variable sum input, and it's going to be empty so that it can hold the user's input. Then we're going to use a while loop. So this is basically saying, while the user input is empty, it's going to ask for the user to put in a response. Then within that loop, we're going to use a conditional. And these conditionals are going to check whether or not the user input is valid. So this is telling Python if the user input is not a digit. And here we have sum input, which is the variable that we've defined before. And then we're using the is digit operation from Python. So if their input is not a digit, we're going to tell them that their input was not valid. Then we're going to put an else statement, and we're going to redefine the sum input variable once again. We're pulling their response as sum input, and we're converting it to an integer. This way Python can read it correctly. Then we're going to do another check, where we're telling Python if the user input is less than the minimum or greater than the maximum, it's going to output a statement saying that it isn't a valid choice. Then finally, we're going to return the user response back so that it can be used later. So here we put minimum maximum and not a number because we can end up injecting the numbers that we want later in the program. So for example, with this function, we're giving the user 5 options to pick from. So we're going to have our check choice function and we're going to give it the numbers 1 through 5. And we're going to define the use of this function as a variable called choice so that we can use it easier for each conditional. This function uses lists. A list in Python is basically just a collection of values. And what we do is we define it to a variable. And we can call upon those variables to use it for operations or calculations in Python. For example, we have the gun deaths list here. We have a function that retrieves the minimum value of a list here. So we're going to call that function and give it the gun deaths list. And then we're going to convert it to a string. For our general solution summarized, we have print functions that just hold what we want to print for the user. We have the check choice function, which checks whether user input is valid. Plot functions that use the matplot library to plot visualizations using the data we give it. Compute functions, which make calculations based on lists or data that we give it. Read functions read the CSV files that we give it. And then clean functions clean those CSV files. And then we have our manager functions, which manages all of these sub-functions. And then also our main manages the manager functions. Here's an example of the plot functions. They're very vague so that we can call it within any data or list. One of the most helpful and impactful sources within this program is our second data set. And we're using that data set as a data frame within Python. We use this by doing panda data frames, which is basically a 2-dimensional array, and it holds values within a table and columns. An example of how I used it in this program is that I take the CSV file of the data set and I read it into a data frame here with this function. And then I can easily use that data frame to clean it. There were a lot of missing values within the age, intent, place, and race columns, and I filled those using this code to replace those empty columns with things like undetermined, unspecified, and then for the age, I used the mean age just so that I can not lose any valuable data while keeping the integrity of the data set. Unfortunately, I don't use a dictionary anywhere within this program, but just for an example, a dictionary is similar to a list, except it assigns keys to each value, and this allows us to organize how we use values easier. And finally, we have main, where all the functions are organized to complete the program. In main, we're giving the functions everything they need to operate. We're defining our CSV files to a variable and then giving the functions that variable. So as you can see, our program works as expected. It allows the user to view certain visualizations and calculations. And next, we'll go over what we learned from these things. Our assumption for the question, how has gun violence changed over time, was true. As you can see from these calculations, the amount of firearm deaths increased by 53% from the year 2014 to 2022. We can also see that change on this scatter chart here. With our second question, we were also right. Suicide was the highest turnout for the incidents. Gun violence injuries occur 80% more than gun violence deaths. And from 2014 to 2022, the amount of suicide deaths increased by 26%. For our third question of where was gun violence the most frequent, on a state-by-state basis, the states of Texas, California, Florida, Georgia, and Illinois take up about half of the firearm deaths in the country. And when we get really specific with it, most people died from gunshot injuries at home. This can also be compared to the high suicide rate, and it's an example of how those trends follow each other. Here we can see the distribution of each place where people died. And for our final question of who's dying to gun violence the most, our second data set was really great for this question. The mean age for each incident type stayed relatively the same, at about 40 years old. Males died disproportionately more than females. And contrary to our predictions, white people were dying more than any other race. Overall, the findings from this project were really interesting because they easily confirmed some assumptions, but for other assumptions, they heavily proved otherwise. And it goes to show that educating yourself and doing research on topics like this is so important because your assumptions might not always be right. Thank you for watching.